Habitat is, quite simply, an organism's home. It's the native environmental setting that a plant or an animal occupies, that it's meant to live, thrive, and survive in. These habitats link together to form fantastically complex ecosystems where life abounds in harmony. With each organism playing a role, the ecosystem reaches balance. At least till the humans show up. Yes, in the never-ending quest to ruin everything beautiful and sacred in this world, we humans have successfully managed to add yet another grave infraction to our long list of misdeeds. Join me for a moment as we discuss habitat loss. Part 1. The problem. If you look at this diagram, you'll notice that the various organisms depicted here form a complex web. Each species relies on others. This concept of varied organisms forming an interwoven community is referred to as the ecosystem. As Hansky wrote in her 2011 paper on biodiversity and habitat loss, the habitat, that is, the place where this community exists, is crucial for maintaining biodiversity. Its loss is disastrous for these communities, and that makes sense. It's literally the destruction or degradation of the places these organisms call home. I mean, where are they supposed to go? What are they supposed to do once it's gone, you know? Now, there are a number of reasons why humans destroy native habitat, and probably the most important and widespread one is basically that we need room to do stuff. This could be resource extraction, agriculture, transportation, or my least favorite, suburban sprawl. It's just the worst. I hate it. Going back to transportation for a second, I'd just like to point something out here. You'll notice that on either side of the highway, there are two potential habitats, because, it looks like woods, but they're separated by this large road. That's called fragmentation, and even though it leaves a little bit of habitat left, it doesn't really serve the same ecological purpose. Unfortunately, little parcels of land the size of a postage stamp can't really support a diverse habitat, as Matthews et al. Wrote in their 2014 paper. I hope I speak for all of us when I say that the loss of habitat and associated species diversity is horrible in and of itself. But as Inouye and Spielman, Ceballos et al., Matthews, and Nakagiri and Tainaka state in their respective papers, this is a human problem too. We benefit immensely from healthy ecosystems, especially when we consider the benefits we gain from them, such as pollinator populations for our food supply. So as we've discussed, this is a big problem, and it may lead you to wonder, what does the media have to say? Before we begin, I'd like to make clear my biases, because I do have them, and I feel that they come through a bit in my presentation. I generally lean leftward, and from witnessing the conservative response to climate change and other issues, I've come to regard any scientific claims from the right with some skepticism. I will say, this project actually kind of helped reshape my view of this a bit, as the results I found were not the results I expected. Part 2. The right. My initial thoughts going in were that the right sources would approach the issue from an economic perspective, arguing that while habitat loss is a problem, job growth, economics, and corporate interests are important enough to make it a necessary evil, and this didn't end up being entirely accurate. Also, given my previous experience with right-wing climate change positions, I believed that their arguments might not necessarily be rooted in science. Now, my right-wing media sources were Fox and Newsmax. For Fox, I was only able to find 4 articles within the time frame of my project, which is the last 5 years, back to 2016. As far as articles go, though, they're not the worst. The subjects here are small invertebrate predators, such as spiders. I was actually shocked to find that the language was science-driven, with the author going so far as to state, quote, "The results show that humans are having a major impact on the world's ecosystems," end quote. That had gravity to me, considering my preconceived notions. The source material came from a scholarly research article published by the British Ecological Society, so this article was actually standing on firm scientific ground. Good for you, Fox. In most of the remaining articles, Fox follows this general coding format, where it focuses on a species or population affected by habitat loss rather than dealing directly with the problem of habitat loss itself. The next article focuses on insects and the effects of light pollution and habitat loss on their populations, although habitat loss is only briefly mentioned. Another of the articles focuses on Kirtland's warbler, a bird recently taken off the endangered species list due to habitat restoration efforts. Now, the fourth article isn't really an article per se, it's an op-ed piece. This one is interesting because it takes a much more ideological slant than the other articles. The author is one Colin O'Mara, president and CEO of the National Wildlife Federation. He argues that the renewable fuel standard passed by Congress in 2007 was a misguided, if well-intentioned effort that resulted in massive habitat loss. The reason is that the renewable fuel standard increased the demand for corn for making biofuels, resulting in the loss of 5.7 million acres of habitat to expanded farm fields. This was especially bad for tallgrass prairie habitats in the Midwest, one of the most endangered habitats in the U.S. due to agriculture. Interestingly enough, this right-wing media source published a rather left-twinged article here calling for increased government regulation of the agricultural sector and increased funding for habitat conservation. So kudos to Fox for presenting what I imagine would be pretty counterproductive towards what I imagine were their aims. How about that? Moving right along, we come to Newsmax. I was able to find 5 whole articles from them. Wow! Now, the Newsmax articles fell into more or less the same patterns as the Fox articles. 2 of them feature an endangered species, whose endangerment is at least partially caused by habitat loss. These deal with monarch butterflies and bald eagles, respectively. The eagle article discusses thriving populations in the lower 48 states. This one shocked me a little bit because it seemed to portray Donald Trump in a little bit of a negative light. Scandal. Nah, it wasn't that exciting. It merely stated that Democrats and environmental groups criticized the Trump administration for supposedly undermining the Endangered Species Act and reducing critical habitat for owls and wolves. So that was interesting. The butterfly article contained mostly things we've discussed already. No habitat means lower butterfly numbers. Science was taken seriously, and it seemed to be presented in a rather urgent language. One thing I did find interesting was that this article brought up COVID as a potentially influencing factor, influencing the destruction of the habitat. The claim was that a lack of tourism encouraged illegal loggers to cut the pine trees the butterflies live on. Other articles included a report on opposition to an airport in the Albanian wetlands, in which the codes were extremely similar to previous articles, and an article about opposition to a pipeline project in Minnesota. This article differs from the others because it is rather human-focused in terms of impact. That is to say, it illustrates people as the victims of natural habitat loss. Discussing the impact on tribal lands of the Ojibwe people, the pipeline project would interrupt their way of life as they rely on a habitat that produces wild rice. So the right seems to have defied my expectations. They've generally represented habitat loss as a serious problem, using science to back their claims. Generally, though, habitat loss has been framed through the lens of an effect, rather than directly addressing the problem itself. I wonder if the left will do better. Part 3. The Left. My sources for the left were CNN and MSNBC. To start, I'd like to address a familiar topic: bald eagles. On the same day as the Newsmax article, which was March 24th, 2021, CNN also published an article on the eagle's resurgence. For one thing, The CNN article is much shorter, only a few paragraphs. Both articles referenced a speech from Deb Haaland, the Secretary of the Interior, as she described the national symbology represented by the eagle. In the CNN article, though, a quote from the speech in which she references the importance of the bald eagle to indigenous peoples occurs, whereas the Newsmax article did not include this. Otherwise, they were more or less the same. In many ways, CNN did pretty much exactly what I expected them to. They seem to hold a staunch pro-environment stance. This article, about proposed labor laws in Indonesia, makes clear that CNN is against habitat loss. They barely yield a paragraph to the opposition point of view, that is, the economic growth perspective. That's great. I agree with them. It is biased. Further articles use similar dire language and take a decidedly pro-environment stance. Yay, CNN. Similarly to their right-wing counterparts, habitat loss is generally framed through the lens of an effect rather than the more abstract root issue. The final source is MSNBC. Kind of. Yeah, MSNBC turned out to kind of be a massive disappointment. Unbelievably, I was only able to find 2 articles on this subject from them, and neither is technically in my time frame. I could have looked for another source, but that fact kind of wowed me enough that I felt that I should include it. The first is about how the bee colony collapse, caused partially by habitat loss, is an overblown issue. This is from 2015, if you were wondering. The language is dismissive, but it does cite interviews with experts. Now, the only other article I could find about habitat loss and biodiversity is from 2006, 10 years before my time frame, about an eBay ban on selling sawfish. The language is serious and direct. Habitat loss is only mentioned once, almost as a side note, though, as to why the sawfish is endangered. Part 4. Conclusions. At the beginning, I stated my research questions in something of an indirect way, so here they are more concisely. I wanted to know whether ideology affects the portrayal of habitat loss as a problem in itself or through the context of its effects. I also wanted to know if the type of example that was used of the effects depended on ideology. For Fox, only one article, the op-ed about the renewable fuel standard, looked at habitat loss as the problem. The others all considered an effect of habitat loss as the main issue being reported on. From Newsmax, it was the same story, with only one problem-oriented article, the report on monarch butterfly habitat being destroyed. The rest of them focused on an effect. CNN was in exactly the same position, with only one of its articles being problem-oriented, that being the article about the labor laws in Indonesia leading to more habitat loss. And MSNBC was 100% effects. Also, they don't seem to think habitat loss is an issue. So what I've been able to conclude from this study is that habitat loss really doesn't receive a whole lot of attention in the media. Even in articles where it's something of a main cause, it's basically overshadowed by certain aspects of its effects. This isn't surprising, as news agencies need people to click the articles, and the fact of the matter is, habitat loss in and of itself is a slow process that's not really that shocking. It just doesn't follow the if it bleeds, it leads mentality that's overwhelming in news media. In terms of partisan bias, I was honestly pretty surprised by the right's willingness to more or less tell it like it is, with scientific backing. In terms of habitat loss, the left didn't really bring any surprises to the table. They were as hardline as I thought they would be. Both had a mix of human portrayal in there, with some articles emphasizing human effects and some not mentioning them at all. Ultimately, I think neither do justice to what I believe is a very, very grave issue, and that is habitat loss. Thank you very much.